Looks like everybody's joining us now. Uh, Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jeff from Asiata, the activities coordinator here at YCAPS. I'm stepping in today for our usual host and program director of the series, Amani Kidd, who's behind the scenes today doing technical things and such like that in the chat. So she is here with us as well. Alongside of myself and Amani, we are also joined by Professor Haruko Satoh, who'll be presenting on Turning Japanese, Understanding Japan in the Age of Populism and Identity Politics. A little bit about our speaker today. Professor Satoh is specially appointed professor at the Osaka School of International Public Policy, Osaka University, and country manager for the JDS India. She's recently concluded a 5-year project, Peace and Human Security in Asia, toward a meaningful Japan-Korea partnership supported by the Korea Foundation. And she previously worked on the Peace and Human Security in Asia project from 2011 to 2016 with 6 Southeast Asian universities. Before joining OSIPP, she worked at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and Geico Forum. And of course, her resume goes on and on and on beyond that. But to save a bit of time, I will shorten it up and I will refer you to our webpage where you can see her full bio. But I would like to mention she does have several publications. Her main interests are primarily in state theory, Japanese nationalism, and identity politics in foreign relations. And like I said, the publication she has Japan and North Korea, Reminders of Forgotten Realities, Middle or Muddle, with or post Abe Japan, and many others. So definitely we're very, very excited to have Professor Satoh with us today. One final note, I just want to mention everyone, please refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. We want to avoid any hot mics or other things that are going to interrupt our speaker's presentation today. For those that have questions, I encourage everyone to please put your questions into the chat. We do encourage a active chat, both discussion and questions in the chat box. And then myself and Amani will pull those questions out of the chat box to present to Dr. Satoh, or excuse me, Professor Satoh later. That being said, I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Satoh. And yeah.
Thank you for everyone at White Apps, including Jeff and Amani, for organizing this talk. My name is Haruko Satoh, and I have noticed in the audience some very old friends too, which makes me very, very nervous because they know how much how I suppose what sort of views and opinions I have about many of the things, but particularly something to do with what's going on with right-wing politics today. Anyway, today I've been invited to the first idea that the Whitecaps pitched was what does it mean to be Japanese? And that sort of stirred a lot of questions in my head, partly because I am Japanese, but I grew up abroad. And so I am one of what you call kikokushijo. I'm a returnee. I go in and out of the country. I grew up in Japanese schools as well as attended universities and schools in the UK as well as in the US. So part of my life, most of my life has been informed about seeing Japan both as a Japanese inside and also as a Japanese outside, not so much seeing Japan from the outside as a foreigner, but as a Japanese being seen as a Japanese in a foreign country. They're very different things. So I thought rather than make this, because I do international politics, so I don't do a precise sort of anthropological or cultural anthropological studies, but I realized that perhaps living well over half a century might give me some insights and reflections that might be useful to those who are in active professional age, and particularly those who might be puzzled, surprised, or just inquisitive about what is going on, for example, with immigration politics, while we're getting all these sort of, cheap populist rhetoric out of our politicians, and whether this indicates anything of a fundamental shift from where, I suppose. So, but I don't want to make it too complicated. So I've sort of decided I'm going to title my talk Turning Japanese, which for some might ring a bell because it's a punk rock song from the UK in the early 80s. One hit wonder band called The Vapors. But anyway, and I'm going to talk about two things because I only have half an hour. One is to sort of touch upon what some of you may recognize, Orientalism. So this Edward Said's famous book, but Orientalism as a lens of looking at countries other than yours, but usually it's sort of west towards the east, but sometimes the Asians looking at themselves in reflection through the West, and so on and so forth. So that sort of Orientalism or racism or colonialism or whatever you want to call it as a lens or the bias by which all of us sort of tend to perceive each other. And the next part, I'm going to talk a bit about, with that in mind, Japan's modern nation myths. So to unpack what is the source of today's right-wing Japanese nationalism? Why is it being caused? And also, what are the roots? And this has a lot to do with Japan's modern history and also the sort of juncture between pre-war Japan and post-war Japan. So those are the two main things I'd be talking about. So without further ado, I would like to sort of get in. As I said, I sort of had to think about the title of this talk, because it really does, in a broad sense, it's a very complex topic, but at the same time, it's kind of interesting. And first, I thought of using Turning Japanese, which is a punk rock song. The other song I thought of using as a title is Big in Japan, which is by a German band called Alphaville. But I turned to this Turning Japanese because it had this rather Orientalist singles case and the illustration, which shows you Turning Japanese. So this is 1980 and how the West, or let's just stick to the UK, for example. The UK, it was in interest how it imagined Japan. And Japan was very much in the popular imagination of Western countries. Remember, this is the Cold War. And so the United States and the European countries all had some images of Japan from the previous sort of the war period, but at the same time, the ones that came back after 1945 with this sort of resurrected economy and another sort of export-oriented country of a different scale altogether from pre-war Japan. You started to dominate the world, well, at the time, the Western world's market, from cars to radios to, home electronics and so on and so forth. If you've lived through this in the past, you know what I'm talking about. But if you were born maybe in the past 30 years, perhaps you would like to imagine how the West is treating China and Chinese economic might at the moment. It's almost like an eerily same pattern of how Western countries, including the United States, were reacting to Japanese economic success. But this is something to do with, as I said, we have to sort of look at Orientalism and racism and whatever it is that also has historical roots, and Japan being different, exotic, all of these things. And I'd just like to remind, and I use this illustration because, in a way, it typifies an image. It's no mistake that this is Japanese. So the second slide is this. I just use these keywords: empire, rising sun, and then the rising yen. So we are talking in the 70s and 80s, when Japan's economic success was really, really causing a lot of, also beginning to cause, not only was it being wowed as the Asian sort of miracle, but sort of treated also with some, well, fear, and threat perception, and also a lot of making fun of it. So I'm just using this cover of a book called The Land of the Rising Yen by George Miklos, who's an Hungarian writer residing in the UK at the time. And he sort of writes, well, humorist basically. And this book, if you come across it, it is filled with hysterical, very serious, stereotypical illustrations of the Japanese, from the kimono to the tourists with cameras and so on and so forth. It's all in there. And this is one of the first books I bought in the UK when I moved there in 1980, partly because it was shocking. It was the way I was, I think, 15 or 14. And it was, the first time I was in the UK, and the way that it was being depicted was, why are we using this very old, Mount Fuji print with a 10 yen coin and everything depicting, as I said, this Orientalist image. So, and when I started reading it, it was also educational, not so much about how it was educational about Japan, but about the gaze, about how Japan was seen, depicted, understood. And as a kid, teenager, I thought it was a bit unfair. But in any case, it's something you grow up with. And this is why I said, well, I grew up with, going in and out of Japan. And most of the time, from my experience in being in the West, either in the United States or in the UK, it was not a good time to be a Japanese because we were succeeding so much that, you just get badmouthed and saying, you're trying to kill our industries, you're destroying our car manufacturing, and so on and so forth. And so growing up like that, it was sort of, okay, this is not fun. But what I wanted to say is that this is in some ways, we have these unconscious bias that, as a grown up now, I know that we have them too. The Japanese have some unconscious bias towards the West. We also have that form of Orientalism that is inverted. So we project our image of ourselves in the image of how the West would want to project us. I'm not going to talk about the complicated version of this, but what I wanted to share today is really that we all have them. Cultural appropriation, misappropriation, or wokeness or not, we all have biases. We all have unconscious sort of, what we in Japanese call iromegane. We call them anything, but the point is, when we talk about racism or other forms of discrimination, I am beginning to find that the best way is to recognize that I am racist too. And you think like, oh, how can you be racist? But the point is, it's very, very, it's easier if you come from that perspective, and then you see things in a different light. And also you share the same perception. So this is, just have these random pictures of what comes up when you Google Tokyo or when you Google Japan and so on. And I juxtaposed the Tokyo Tower with the Eiffel Tower, partly because this is very symbolic. Tokyo Tower was built in the 1960s, and it's taller than the Eiffel Tower, and it's 10 times lighter than the Eiffel Tower. But the point was, this was for the Japanese, the pinnacle of Japanese sort of advanced steel technology and building, architectural technology. And so we were taught that Tokyo Tower was modeled after the Eiffel Tower, but we beat the Eiffel Tower in terms of height and weight, and so on and so forth. So this is us learning about how to compare ourselves, where to place ourselves with the West in the, I suppose, 60s and 70s. And now I'm going to show you, this is the picture of Yasukuni Shrine. And the first thing, I don't know how many people would think about it, would be this SDF. They're not supposed to really go officially, but this is the sort of symbol of Japanese militarism and so on and so forth. And so this is another picture. It's almost like when you talk about SDF or Japanese history problem, or us abandoning the pacifist constitution, all these headlines, they all get attached to these images, right? The past, military, so on and so forth. This is, as I said, me growing up, sort of being identified with a lot of these associations, partly because I also grew up in a generation where my friends in the UK, their parents, fathers, or grandparents were actually interned, say, in Hong Kong, or in Indonesia. So you meet these people, and they have nothing good to say, for example. So these war legacies are legacies, and but I am actually really surprised how long these negative views have endured, and that how easy it is for whether American, Chinese, read like Facebook posts and unfriendly, unkind, and sometimes malicious comments follow certain things about Japan. I don't know if the Japanese politicians are reading this, because, but if they read in English, certain things are pretty nasty. And so just as the last thing to go back to the 80s, so this is a film called Gung Ho. I'm sure that a lot of you know RoboCop, but Gung Ho came around the same time, and it is starring Michael Keaton. It's directed by Ron Howard. And it came out in 1987, and it's really about an American car manufacturer somewhere in, I don't know, maybe it's Pennsylvania, I don't remember. But it goes bankrupt and it's taken over by a Japanese automaker. And the cultural clash and, the different ways of work and so on and so forth, it's like your very original sort of clash of civilizations almost in a car factory over manufacturing cars. And this is something that really stuck in my mind, as Ronald Reagan said that Japan was a greater threat than the Soviet Union because of how much sort of economic power Japan had. And so we're carrying all of this, and I just want to remind, I don't want to sort of go into talking about Mario Brothers and so on, but this is something that perhaps we can sort of bookend from, say, 1964, when Japan held the first Tokyo Olympic Games, till maybe 2020, when the last, or 2021, when we had the sort of almost virtual Olympic Games. But in a way, I would like you to evoke all of these images and the stereotypes, negative and positive, you have about Japan, before I go finally spend the next maybe 7 minutes talking about, as I said, a bit of theory about the sources of today's Japanese nationalism, which sometimes is actually invoked because of these images that the Japanese carry themselves. So very importantly, as theoretically, but something that I think sometimes it's useful for everybody to perhaps share a lot more, is that Japanese, or any country actually, French, American, British, so on, it's a modern construct. Modern is basically the past 200 years after, American Revolution, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, so on. It's 200 years. And this is something that we all need to accept. Otherwise, we get into a lot of sort of difficult positioning. And therefore, nation states, as we all are in this international system, are also modern. Nations, in that sense, are imagined communities. I think perhaps somebody who studied history or anthropology may have come across a scholar named Benedict Anderson, who wrote a famous book about this, titled The Imagined Communities, which basically says that all nations, when we call nations in this modern sense, they are politically constructed, politically or socially engineered, with things like, foundation myths, national history making, or sharing the language, standardizing the language, and so on and so forth. And these are basically some of the sort of templates of most nation states, even if it's post-colonial, like colonial independence, so on. The idea is to give coherence to a national identity, a sense of unity, sense of belonging, right? Patriotism, with the flag, with the national anthem. These are all things that try to evoke a sense that I'm Japanese. I'm seeing the Japanese flag being raised at the Olympics, and I'm hearing the national anthem, and you feel, I don't know, happy, whatever. The same. This is very modern. It's sort of, and it's a collective sort of psychological feeling. But the point is, it's important when we try to understand nationalism in any country today, whether they're right-wing populists and try to be anti-immigration and so on and so forth. These are all sort of causes of modern nation state making, as well as contestations that occur within those ideas that originally encompassed or tried to bring together or create this imagined community. So contested ideas are also very much part of what's going on, for example, with populist movements, or, for example, what is going on with the idea of who's an American. Under President Trump, I think this is being put to the test. And if you imagine it that way, I think you'll understand what it is about, say, for example, Japan, that is also being contested. This is not about a unified country or homogeneous, monoethnic country trying to, sort of resurrect this idea of ultranationalism. This is actually about a country that, well, an archipelago that was actually quite diverse. Yes, it had a central, well, not a centralized government, but it had a government. It was unified, but not necessarily in the way that we think of nation states are. This is before Meiji. So the Meiji Restoration in 1868 So I'm not going to go into the history of but there's one important sort of myth, if you will, that was created as part of this making the imagined community the Japanese. And that is the idea of a nation serving and connected to the emperor. So we're sort of all, and emperor was this body, the sovereign and symbol of the body politic, kokutai. You probably hear it from. And so this is sort of the Meiji Constitution in 1889, and you probably heard combined with the Imperial Rescript on Education, which 1890, which pretty much sets out how the Japanese nations are supposed to be. And this is really the forging of modern Japanese consciousness. What we are seeing right now is, and particularly, or at least one interpretation, is that we probably have heard of Japanese like shrinking demographics. Do we import, do we have more foreign workers? How much can we tolerate? Do we have an immigration policy? And also in the previous election, the advances of some of these very crude populist voices saying, no, only Japanese, authentic Japanese. Like, you tell me who's an authentic Japanese. I'm often called, I'm not a Japanese because I grew up abroad. So you don't have to be a foreigner or a different color. The Japanese get very, very particular. They can be. But what it is happening is that this imagined community is the narrative that is being sold is shrinking. And when it shrinks, and it is shrinking is real. And then you sort of start feeding things like, when we get old, we might not have a Japanese nation. We need a sense of, revive our sense of belonging. For example, if you look at some of the slogans with the 2011 earthquake, Kizuna, which is like, ties that bind. People are looking for a way of finding another sense of belonging. And kokutai, this idea of kokutai, which was supposed to have been dismantled after the war, when we lost the war and the Allied forces tried to democratize and demilitarize Japan, because the institutions, the imperial institutions remained, as some of you know, as part of the way of governing post-war Japan, it was just, you couldn't have suddenly killed or try the emperor for war crimes. This idea of kokutai and some things that are linked to the myth of Meiji, or the Meiji nation making, survived. And so this is basically the sort of well, I suppose when I was growing up, right-wing nationalism, you couldn't see them very much at all. It just look more like a cult movement. But today, when we start talking about or even evoking things that are about the kokutai, like, for example, let's make it criminal to desecrate the flag. All of these things sort of point to a return, or at least a nostalgia for the Meiji idea of, or ideas of what the Japanese are supposed to be. The only point being is that this is also sometimes it's ahistorical and it only applies in certain contexts, which I'm happy to answer in the Q&A. But what I'd like you to sort of, to end the talk with this sort of uh, wish for everybody to actually look at Japanese nationalism or right wing or some of the discourse that's taking place also with a historical perspective like this. And also with, I think, an understanding that we all are sort of suffer from a lot of accumulated biases and lenses of, exoticism, Orientalism, and so on and so forth. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
We will move into the Q&A portion. Oh, we've got a few people just joining us, surprisingly. Very good talk. I'll start with a question or two while giving the audience more time to throw some more questions into the chat box. So please, chat box is open. So if you have any questions, feel free. I'll get us started. You actually preempted a question that I was going to ask. You kind of tied it into what we're seeing with America. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the view of what it means to be Japanese, and I was curious about is there a similar view of what it means to be Japanese amongst the older generation of Japanese and younger generation of Japanese, or is there a bit of a disconnect? Because I feel like in America right now, there's a drastic disconnect. And at least I know for myself, even when I see America today, I'm like, this isn't the America that I grew up with, or these aren't the ideals that I associated with what it means to be American. And what I'm seeing is very prominent now. Obviously, a lot of this is political differences, but I do think generationally, the younger generations of America and the older generations of Americans, and then the middle-aged generations of Americans, there's starting to be wider gulfs between what they feel it means to be American and what they feel is correct and normal. Is there a similar type of thing going on in Japan that's divided by age or not so much?
Yeah, I think age makes a huge difference. As I said, you know, the kids, my university students, right? They only actually know, for example, even about image of Japan. We're talking about overseas image of Japan as, generally positive. We're sophisticated, cool Japan, omotenashi, all of these things. When
Hmm.
anime, video games, to matcha, it's like conquered the world. And so they're generally, my generation is a bit more hung up on,
Maybe war guilt,
well, no, war guilt isn't nothing to do with us. I wasn't born,
of
but
course.
it's the war guilt is for the politicians and
Hmm.
for the older generation to feel, and they do.
Hmm.
But the political class has a different interpretation of war guilt. But the generation gap is huge. Particularly if you think about just the past 20 years, the image of
Hmm.
Japan has changed drastically. Um, and I'm sometimes, I don't even know. I feel happy about it that
So
we're
has
not sort of
that drastic change in the image of Japan, are you referring to domestically, or do you see it also a drastic change in the
internationally.
view of Japan abroad as well?
Just as Japan was losing confidence to turn the politics and economy around, all of a sudden, the Japanese sort of cultural stuff are getting a lot of, well, acknowledgement, appreciation. I mean, it's sort of like the Japanese in the 19th century, sort of with a vengeance, kind of. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, you get Southeast Asian students coming to study in Japan, partly because they said, "No, no, I used to watch Doraemon when I was little."
Hmm.
This is something none of us imagined
Yeah, I feel
when
for my
gung
generation,
ho was
that's
being
a big draw. Like I feel like my generation, and probably the direct, like the people born 10 years within the 10 years after me, there's a strong pull to Japan due to the soft power of its anime and video games and things like that. Recently, I've been seeing online a lot of for younger generations online and with the rise in the incel groups online. I've been seeing a lot of like nationalists or white nationalists that look to Japan as this mono kind of race society, and they tend to sing Japan's praises. So they'll look at any problem that happens in America and they'll say, "Oh, Japan does it right because they don't allow foreigners in Japan. They're 97% Japanese, and that's how you lead a society." And they've been kind of warping this image of this Japanese racial purity as like a thing to aspire to. I don't know if you've seen that image of Japan or that at all, but I've been noticing that recently in the last couple years, which was quite surprising to see. I feel like I don't imagine many Japanese people would want to have that as the image that people take of them.
It depends on where you are. I mean, I'm from Tokyo, but I've spoken to, students based in Kansai, and they have a very different understanding, or even like more of a natural view that, the Japanese are not like this monoethnic, blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
They don't, they know that Japanese are not.
Yes.
But when it comes to America, the American understanding of any country tends to be, rough.
Yes. Well, I see
And
this coming from Europeans a lot as well, but yes, I agree. I don't agree that it is a correct view of Japan, but I feel that it is a common overseas view of Japan. Um, but yeah.
no, no, I mean, I think it's really the brute force of racism, I have to tell you, is it's not funny at all.
Yeah.
Europe has its racism, but American racism is because it is ingrained in the politics, so sometimes it comes across even as a positive assessment of, say, the Japanese, because they are
Mhm.
so conscious of you being Japanese. And I'm like, I'm not as Japanese as you think I am, kind of.
That
So
that
that's
that
that's
reminds me of the
that's
Orientalism that you mentioned back in the day, this fantasy of Orientalism and like a Western view and us thinking, well, this is what it is when it could be very far from the truth. Uh, to
mm,
go into some
mm.
more questions from the audience, so I don't want to take all of the Q&A myself. We had a few very interesting questions. One thing I'm going to start with Fred Varso's question, and he
Barco,
wanted to ask.
Barco,
Varco,
Fred
apologies
Barco.
on that. So it seems someone you know or familiar with. He
Yes,
asked,
I do.
can you talk about I thought his question was very good. Can you talk about the role of the media and the Japanese media that either hides the reality or dark side of life in Japan, and then Western media that reinforces this fantasy image of Japan?
Oh my God, Fred is asking something that it's very important. It's
Mm,
actually very important because this actually is, like I put in the blurb for the talk, the Japanese play and pander to what the Western media or the Western perception of Japan is.
mm,
But at the same time, if you talk about, say, for example, human rights, international marriage, or like, custody of, divorced kids, so on and so forth. Um, there's some very touchy issues where the Japanese or Japanese government really don't want to have interference from other countries. Like any other Asian country, Japan actually do not like domestic interference. Nonetheless, because it's part of a responsible member of the international community, so they do have to have some position. Um, and the Japanese press, and I think, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer Fred's question, but the one that sort of makes me very worried, and it's very historical, is about that sort of our treatment of minorities, which doesn't get written or even reported, even in Japan and the Western press. If they write anything at all, it's very, very
mm,
sort of, it's not mainstream. There are other, many, many other sort of dark things, like, whether it's organized crime but we do have a segregated class.
mm.
We also have, as some of you may know, the Zainichi, which is like,
Yes.
the Koreans or the Chinese or the Indians were permitted to stay permanently, but do not have Japanese citizenship, which also goes to points to the question of when you ask a Japanese, so what does it mean to be Japanese? And sometimes if you say, oh, I have a Japanese passport, that's the correct answer, right? And then you ask, like, what does it take to be Japanese?
Mm.
And most people want to say blood because it's just a reflex, right? You
Legally,
have to be
that's not the
born to
case, correct?
Japanese, yeah. But which is a bit, that's again, I'm saying it's sometimes a bit rubbish.
Mm.
Um, because there are many, many people, if you go, centuries and centuries, just do the DNA, we still haven't settled on, oh, do we have like three sources or two sources or blah, blah, blah. And the one thing that, the media or like the mainstream do not want to admit that is that the imperial lineage has Korean roots.
Amani, you'll have
Now
to
I'm
edit
going to
that
be
out
targeted by
later.
the right way. So I think that is um, one of and the Western media, the fantasy images. I think part of it is also, lazy reporting.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
the point is the Japanese media is not exactly particularly, I don't know, adventurous
Yes,
in
that's a good
delivering.
That's a polite way to put it, I would say. It's really interesting because even talking about just basic media portrayal, I notice is very much even in the West, we have this image of what we want and what we like Japanese people to be like, and we like to report on that. Every couple years during big sports tournaments, I will see the same articles about Japanese fans cleaning up the stadiums after the matches. And of course, right now the World Cup is happening, and you open up BBC, you open up a variety of things, and what are the articles that are immediately popping out? Japanese fans are so great. They clean up the stadiums afterwards, and it's all over Twitter and social media as well. And then, but what I've noticed this year, which I haven't seen in the past, is an increasing response from Japanese Twitter of Japanese uh, online netizens rolling their eyes and posting photos of local stadiums with trash everywhere, and like it's not the reality. This is all manufactured to produce an image of what we want. Either we want people to think Japan is, or what people want to think Japan is, right? So even on
Mm.
minor things like that, it
Mm.
seems to be pervasive, without even getting to the deeper realities of the racism and things like that. I remember I was shocked when I first moved to Japan and I was going to university here, and near my university, there was a Zainichi Korean school. And I would notice quite regularly the police would have to blockade the road, and ultranationalists would drive by on their cars and shout obscenities to junior high school students. And I was shocked because I had
Mm.
never known this was in Japan, right? I'd never seen this aspect of Japan from any portrayals that I had seen, right? Whereas perhaps it would have been a little bit beneficial if people were more open and honest about these type of things, right?
I think it's just sometimes you give, whether it's the Western press reinforcing or the Japanese press being silent,
Mm.
is that one thing, I just wanted to move to Fred's second question, which is about
Yeah.
Sanseto and xenophobia,
Yes.
is that, sometimes, well, at the moment, Sanseto has definitely given oxygen to these xenophobic views.
Mm.
I am not saying that the Japanese are not xenophobic. They are very, because this is, if you grow up with people looking like you, and then, the best thing you can do is to sort of point out how different you are. Um, just because, you grew up abroad or whatever. I mean, this is Japan's categorization of, you're with us, you're not.
Mm.
Imagine different skin, different religion. I mean, it's just, and I think um we are only beginning to engage with all of these bombardment questions and issues that are being politicized partly because um if you talk about like even foreign workers, they are forced to, the policies towards them, the national government did not and still does not have proper guidelines.
Mm.
I have I and so everything the it's done locally, whether it's with the Japanese Brazilians who came like more than 2 decades ago, and now Odashi had to deal with it. And other places where there's a huge concentration, like in Chiba, right? Of Afghan people from Afghanistan, Pakistan. Kobe also has a lot of people from, Pakistan. Like how they settle, whether they build mosques and all of these things, they just, it's the local authorities, right? They have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's taken up this national interest, which I think it did reach a sort of saturation point until, even though Abe-san was the one who was responding about foreign workers, and so we have to open the gates, and now we're sort of trying to close it seems. But my view is that I think we have to probably be vigilant about what is going on with this, as I said, locator crass speech coming out from the likes of Satoh, who
Yeah.
know nothing, or some of our politicians who know other politicians who obviously have a chip on their shoulder or historically ignorant,
Mm,
so that we don't give more oxygen, particularly in social media, about these, xenophobic views that are hurtful. And it's
mm,
probably like, working with universities or other communities would probably be very important. But as I said, the national government's been too slow to
yeah.
recognize what needs to be done. So,
Mm. Yeah, the
yeah.
Sanseito is very interesting. I think for many of us that are foreign residents in Japan, we were quite surprised to see the recent election results, and that those of us that were watching the rhetoric around Sanseito. But interesting enough, I actually had numerous younger Japanese friends that interestingly enough, work in and around foreign residents, and their boss is a foreign resident, and their boss always looks out for them, and they love their boss and great relations. Yet then they voted for Sanseito, and they didn't realize they actually didn't make the connection. This one person that I'm thinking of didn't make the connection between Sanseito and nationalist or anti-foreigner viewpoint because they didn't really go past the view of, they kind of got sucked in with this idea of like strong Japan and feeling proud to be Japanese, and they had kind of heard these type of talking points. And of course, that resonates with them because I think that resonates with most people. They like to feel like, oh yeah, we're strong, and it's good to feel strong. It's good to be proud to be Japanese or American or Chinese or whatever, right? This is very normal
Mhm.
stuff. But they didn't look deep enough to see, well, what else is this party doing, or what are they trying to do for this? And then they ended up voting Sanseito and talking proudly about it. And then one of their boss's boss, their main supervisor, was like, "What the hell? You voted for Sanseito, but your boss is a foreigner. What are you?" He's always taking care of you. And he's like, "Huh? What? I don't understand." And he didn't connect those two dots. Um, do you think there's a lot of people that are kind of in that situation and they're not really looking deeply enough and understand, or is it just they are really that popular in their views?
I really can't say,
Uh,
with any accuracy, but if you talk about a press that's not functioning properly, and if you're just sort of seeing the social media world, this is why I said, we need to be vigilant about what's going
mm,
on. I do have students who did vote for Sanseto, but they're just as you described, they didn't think it was going to be blah blah blah.
mm,
But at the same time, you have students who say, oh, I only watch the news on YouTube. And I'm like, okay. So we have it's more of a, political literacy problem,
that's
which this is precisely where, populism seeps in, right?
yes, that's a very good
So,
point. Yeah.
mm,
Um,
so I think
you
that's
mentioned a bit about government policies and the government needing to be more proactive and things like that, and then confusion around, a lot of government says this, but then locals saying that, and then they're trying to get more foreigners, but trying to get rid of more foreigners, and it's almost like a bit of disconnect with what's going on. Joseph Tomei had asked about, I know a lot of foreign residents are also thinking about things with the whether it's visa issues or citizenship issues. Obviously, we know that for a long time there's been an issue where in Japan they don't honor dual citizenship, and I think 2021, 20 or 22, you have to
Mm.
revoke any double citizenship. You have to decide I'm going to
Yes,
stay
yes, you do.
Japanese or American or whatever. But for a long time, people kind of wouldn't do that or they didn't need to. Apparently, there's been a case around a Yuri Kondo. I'm not familiar with this myself, but if you're familiar with that case, Joseph Tomei was asking if you could talk a little bit about these type of issues currently.
I actually don't know. Sorry, I haven't read the case, but
Mhm.
on dual citizenship, is I have friends who have, born with a German passport and have blah, blah, blah. Dual citizenship is a case that I'm actually very uncomfortable talking about, partly because um it's the cases are different. The Japanese way of saying you cannot have dual citizenship is a policy, it's a line of thing which I'm sort of, I don't this, as I said, is something to do with the definition of Japanese citizenship. I just had a friend who applied for Japanese citizenship and he's Thai and he just got, refused after 10 or over 10 years, almost 15 years working at Kyoto University. And this is a bit painful. And if there's been a constitutional debate about, in 1946, about what would be the definition of Japanese citizenship. And nobody, everybody's reluctant to write about this or even discuss this because it's almost like opening a Pandora's box. And this is not just because we're monoethnic, it's because we have to touch upon these Zainichi issues, the Buraku issues, all of these things. So, before we get to the dual citizenship issue, there's more to be, I think, done in terms of what we are and
Hmm.
how we want to define our citizenship to be.
That's
We know what are the conditions, and this is, I think we might, if things are not, for example, stirred by somebody, as Fred mentions, Onoda-san, minister, the American Japanese or Japanese American biracial minister who seems to be very xenophobic. If the I think if the debates and discussions are done with sort of wider engagement, like our constitutional debate, which also needs to be sort of a wider thing instead of being driven by a few sort of ideologies and, ideologues. This is an important conversation to have about who's Japanese, right?
Yeah, one of my
And
friends
the
when I was in
history.
university from Russia, he proudly proclaimed how he is now Japanese when he got his Japanese citizenship, and he would
Mm,
always
mm.
proudly display it and look forward to hoping to get pulled over by the police so he could flash his his citizenship.
Yeah, it's like, like Osaka Naomi, when the
Mm,
Japanese sort of sports teams or sports do so much better when you have these, you know, biracial, mixed people, and all of a sudden you have to grudgingly accept that, oh, well, foreign talent, foreign blood is needed.
mm,
So, there's no clear-cut science or answer to these things, but I do think that we've been postponing an informed debate, discussions about this for too long, which is, but it's very sad that it had to come in the form of populism and
yeah.
identity sort of
Yeah, these
mongering, so
identity
to speak.
politics and things like that.
Mm.
Sometimes I wonder if this is some of this stuff like with this with Onoda, like, is some of this stuff performative for domestic, or is it genuine held views? You know what I mean? Because sometimes you can't tell.
I
I
think
feel
it's
the same way in the
performative,
States.
particularly it is, I think it is, because if you know the Japanese ministries, like Ministry of Labor, Ministry of however much the politics turns rightwards, there is something very rooted in Japanese post-war bureaucracies that tend to hold progressive sort of views
Mm,
about labor policies and immigrant policies. Of course, but she's just a horrible mouthpiece. I'm sorry if I'm, she really is shockingly upsetting.
yeah. It's yeah, it is quite surprising. We are running low on time, but I do want to. We have a former speaker, not former, a previous speaker, Travis Seifman. I want to. Maybe we've been on this a little bit, but I definitely want to bring his question out before we end our topic. He says, "Thank you for your talk." He lives in Kyoto and spends a lot of time in Tokyo. He hears of xenophobic reaction against heavy foreigner populations. Of course, we think of particular provincial locations, smaller cities and towns where you have very large foreigner populations that are helping industry stay alive, for example, around particular industries. Do you think that the recent rise in xenophobia is particularly primarily fueled by those cases, or could it be increased visibility, numerous presence of foreigners in big cities like Kyoto and Tokyo, with especially with tourism, a rise of foreigners buying homes in the Inaka area? Of course, his ideas, he suspects it's a mix of the three, but he'd be curious of your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think it's the mix of three. But as I mentioned before about, some of the experiences of the local authorities having to sort of carry the brunt of all the foreign labor population adjusting their life, like, some other places in Saitama. Um, I am not so sure if those managed situations are providing the seed of discontent or fanning xenophobia. I'm sure they're there. But I have a feeling it's maybe tourists. The buying of property has been going on for a very long time. People have like said it, you know, it's the government that just keeps on ignoring it. Like there were signs that certain places were being bought and so on, like water sources, mountains. This has been going on for 20 years and nobody paid attention, but it'll
Hmm.
hit the news once in a while, like, Hong Kong property magnate buys blah, blah, blah mountain and so on. So, and, but I think it was the over tourism for the past few years, that really, because I do very much sympathize too with Travis about Kyoto. I was there, I because I live in Osaka, so I go to Kyoto once in a while, and you go there on a tourist season, and there isn't a single Japanese person
Mm,
you could see on like some of the main roads. And when I say Japanese, I mean they could be Chinese or Korean, but it's just not. And that's quite a view.
yeah. And with
And
rising costs, I've
it's,
even heard of schools having to, because of rising tourism and tourism's, they can bring more money, so the price of things going up. And schools that traditionally would always take their students to their Kyoto school trip are now having to choose different locations to go to. And for parents, they have that nostalgia for their own childhood trip to Kyoto. And then when their kids now don't get to do that, I can imagine that being upsetting.
well, I mean, I actually feel bad more for the Kyoto locals
Mm,
because their buses are, and I wholeheartedly support the idea that tourists have to pay more
mm,
for, riding public transportation because this is means for them to commute, and which is completely being hijacked by, groups of tourists.
yeah.
And
I,
I actually also went to Kyoto for my middle school trip from Tokyo. But it just might be a good idea. And during the bubble, people went elsewhere. People went
mm,
abroad, not to
mm.
Kyoto. And
Well, good
so
money then.
yeah, so maybe they can sort of also explore other destinations. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that it was just, the image, the picture of overcrowded, even in Tokyo too.
Definitely.
I think that was the ignition, really.
Yeah.
Just
Even
everybody
small
went, oh,
places I've noticed. I went
mm,
to I'll occasionally go down to the Hiroshima area down to Iwakuni, and I go down to the Miyajima Island down there, and in the past I would go and it would be pretty nice, pretty serene, not overcrowded. But I went there maybe like just not even a year ago, and it was absolutely jam-packed with people. Like you could barely even walk around. It felt like a completely different place. And previously, I never saw any other foreigners going there. It was just like me and
mm,
random Japanese school kids in the area, right? But now it was like, as you said, it's just overrun with tons and tons of tourists, where it does feel like a different place altogether. Um, what, at the same time, I'm happy that people can come and experience these things and enjoy Japan and have a good image of Japan. But yeah, I can see why it can be tough. But anyway, we are sadly out of time. I'll give you, if you have any last words on the topic that you'd like to touch base on before we finish today, Professor Sato.
no, thank you very much for allowing me to ramble.
No,
Thank you.
we thoroughly enjoyed it. We very much enjoyed it. It's very good. It's very thought-provoking, and I think it brought a lot of value to our audience. We had several people in the audience asking about if it's going to be uploaded online so that they can share it with their classes and things like that. So thank you very much. It was very,
Thank
very
you.
worthwhile for us, and we really appreciated it. That pretty much
Yes.
covers our upcoming events. Yeah, thanks so much again to our wonderful speaker today, Professor Sato. It was lovely to have you. I'd love to have you back. You are in the Tokyo area, so I'd love to have you maybe for an in-person one of these days. That would be nice. Um, and we can probably get that in-person audience to gain from your knowledge as well. Obviously, those are in Tokyo. The upcoming pub talk on the 29th. If you like today's topic, that might be something within your wheelhouse you might want to check out too. And there is still room for that. And there's going to be bars, so you can have a beer and really let that discussion flow about immigration, right? Um,
No, you don't. You don't.
maybe that's not the best time, eh? No. No, but anyway, everyone, thanks a lot. Have a beautiful evening and stay safe. And we
You.
will see you at the next online webinar or in-person seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
YCAPS would like to thank Mr. Ben Karp. Thank you for your patronage, without which this event could not have happened. Thank you. Bad Tech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.